In the early stages of the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan's plan to invade Virginia progressed in favor of the Union Army. However, the Army of the Potomac met heavy Confederate resistance at Yorktown. From the air, Lowe and General Fitz-John Porter surveyed the heavily fortified area. As Lowe later recalled, "No sooner had the balloon risen above the treetops than the enemy opened all their batteries at us. It was the heaviest shelling I had ever encountered in a balloon. Fearing that keeping the balloon up, the enemy's shots would do injury to the troops that were thickly camped near the balloon's tethers on the ground, General Porter ordered us to land." However, with the advance of the Union Army, the rebels soon deserted the streets of Yorktown in order to strengthen their defenses at Richmond. By the early part of June 1862, the Army of the Potomac managed to secure much of the Virginia Peninsula. Even Lowe and his balloon crew laid claim to securing an area near Harrison's Landing when a small Confederate garrison fled in advance of the balloon boat. They had mistaken the George Washington Parke Custis for the Union ironclad USS Monitor. Despite the progress made in the early stages of the Virginia campaign, as the Union Army came within sight of Richmond, its progress slowed. Part of the reason for this was a strategy devised by two Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, that made the rebel army appear to be much larger than it really was. Jackson took 20,000 men and continually marched them, day and night, all over the Virginia countryside. It seemed as if rebel soldiers were everywhere, and Allen Pinkerton's scouts and spies reported that rebel soldiers actually outnumbered the Army of the Potomac by a sizable margin, although this was not the case. Thaddeus Lowe and his assistants performed numerous ascensions and from their observations reported the true strength of Confederate forces surrounding Richmond. However, many of General McClellan's advisors, including George Armstrong Custer, warned against listening to the observations of the civilian balloonists. In the end, McClellan listened to Pinkerton's reports instead, and quite possibly lost an opportunity to end the war sooner. McClellan's decision not to advance on Richmond because of Pinkerton's report on the exaggerated strength of the Confederate Army proved to be a costly one. Beginning on June 27, 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee staged an offensive against the Army of the Potomac that became known as the 7 Days' Battles. At Gaines' Mill in Mechanicsville, Lowe and his crew managed to keep 2 balloons aloft during the battle in order to furnish McClellan with intelligence of Confederate movements. The observation duties of Lowe and his assistants were performed flawlessly despite the adverse conditions. At one point in the battle, at Gaines' Mill, Lowe's balloon had a clear view of the city of Richmond. But McClellan's inability to act decisively resulted in huge losses for the Army of the Potomac. When the battle finally concluded, the Union Army had suffered almost 16,000 casualties. The actual number of the dead and wounded among the Confederate Army was even higher, although the intense battle had the effect of completely demoralizing McClellan's army. The number of the dead and the wounded on both sides would force significant changes in how the war would be fought from this point forward.